So I think it's probably best if I start giving you a very kind of quick overview of the history of community land ownership. So Scotland has got the most unequal land ownership in the developed world. So around about 100% of people in Scotland own about half the land here. And that's really was the early driver for land reform in Scotland. So yeah, we're a member of the International Land Coalition, and a couple of years ago we were at a global conference on land reform, and I spent the 3 days kind of horrifying people from all over the world about Scotland's land ownership statistics, because it's very unusual in a kind of westernised country to have the concentration of land ownership that we have here. And that kind of, those issues around land reform are really the initial driver for things to change in Scotland. The very first buyouts in Scotland were almost 100 years ago in Glendale and Skye and Stornoway in the Western Isles. And then there was a very long gap before the next ones happened, which the first one in the modern era was really the Isle of Egg, which had been inspired by a buyout of crofters in Assynt, which some of you might have heard of. So those early buyouts were really driven by communities just feeling they had no other choice but to take control of the land. They had poor quality housing, there was no jobs, really down to kind of, years of neglect, sometimes by landowners, or landowners buying islands, for example, and just not investing in them. So those communities were really trying to regenerate their areas. And what they showed, so the early communities like Egg and Knoydart showed that when communities got control of their land, they were able to do amazing things. So one of our directors said they're kind of Heineken of regeneration. They can reach places that other regeneration programs can't reach. So places like Egg started to reverse years of depopulation and started to kind of move from, in Egg they only had 2 hours of electricity a day, and now they're completely self-sufficient in renewable energy, and people visit them from all over the world to learn about them. So in the early days, the driver for community buyouts moved from kind of land reform to being about giving communities another tool they could use to regenerate themselves, because those early models were so successful. And then in 2003, the first community right to buy was given to communities, and if you're listening to Dave Thompson's session later on today, he'll tell you all about that. But we've now got a number of different rights to buy, asset transfer legislation that give communities right to buy land and buildings. But I think it's important to say that still the majority of land and buildings and community ownership are bought through negotiation. That's far more common. But what the legislative rights have done is give communities a kind of backstop if negotiations not an option for them, but they really changed the whole discussion around what rights communities had in Scotland to be able to buy land. And so I don't think without those rights we would have seen the number of negotiated purchases there have been over the last few years. So what is a community landowner? So they must have geographical membership, and membership must be open. So usually you would see a community allowing anyone living in that community to become a member, and usually the community will either require that 50% of members are local, or 75% depending on what type of buyout they're planning to do. And that's just to really ensure that the community keeps local control of that asset. So that's a really important thing to think about at the beginning. Directors are elected, so with a private landowner you might have limited power. If you're lucky, you will get a good landowner. There are many of those, but what you don't have is any power if you're not happy with what they're doing. So with a community buyout, people can elect directors. If they're not happy with what's being done, then people can stand for election and they can go on and change things. They must own land or buildings. So when we say community land ownership, we mean land or buildings, or what we technically call land assets. So anything with land, whether or not it's got something on top of it. And the scale within our membership varies enormously. So our biggest member is Storrs Uist in the Western Isles, which owns 93,000 acres, which is the islands of South Uist, Benbecula and Eriskay. And then we have communities that also own much smaller amounts of land, so it could be a couple of houses, a community centre. But what drives them all is pretty similar. They're really focused on revitalising their area. So in rural areas, the driver is often depopulation, and you often get a buyout happening when something like a primary school closes down. It gives the community a shock that they are losing young people, and so that can be a real driver for the community to think, hold on a minute, we need to do something here. And try and regenerate our area. And so that can be a driver for a community to look and see maybe we need to buy some assets to be able to help us do that. And it's not that dissimilar in urban areas. The focus might not be on depopulation, but it's driven by people who really care about their area and that want to do something to make it better, or they might be frustrated with years of top-down regeneration and think that the community knows what it needs and they could probably do a better job of it. So you've got places like Lynnwood. Lynnwood Community Development Trust has been running for about 10 years. They were named the Pluck on the Plinth about 10 years ago, and that gave a group of women the kind of driver to try and do something about it. So in Lynnwood, that community was really driven by young mums who wanted their kids to grow up in a bit better environment and really wanted to improve the place, and I think they've been really successful doing that. So the rates of community land ownership are in the northwest of Scotland. Really, the Western Isles is a stronghold, so 3/4 of people in the Western Isles live on community owned land now. But over the last, just even 5 years, it's massively spread across Scotland. So you might have seen in the news there's some big buyouts underway in the south of Scotland at the moment, and it's also really taken off in urban areas as well. So somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of buyouts are in urban areas now. What do communities do when they buy the land? Well, it's a massive range of different things depending on what that community needs. So some of the most common ones are affordable housing, renewable energy. Got quite a few communities looking at high street regeneration at the moment, where they've got a lot of kind of vacant property in their high street and it's kind of bringing the feel of the town down. Then communities are looking to purchase buildings to regenerate their high street. But this is a very short list of what communities own. So we've got some common ones like housing, but we've also got some very unusual ones like one community is setting up a whale listening station to attract tourists in the Western Isles. Our member that bought a massive ex-RAF base in Machrihanish is looking at developing it into a spaceport. So the opportunities are really endless on that front. So I'll give you a very quick run through of what a buyout looks like. So you could probably break buyouts into 3 different categories: a negotiated buyout, community right to buy, and asset transfer. So those of you who are joining us later will hear about those ones this afternoon. So I'm going to run you through what a negotiated buyout would look like, just to give you a kind of overview. So those early communities like Egg and Knoydart, they didn't really have a model to follow, so they were the pioneers. They had to find a way through this whole process. But now there's over 400 communities in Scotland owning land and assets. There's a kind of process that communities can follow through step by step. And funders would really expect you to be going through this process to make a good, robust business plan, because once a community owns a land or building, that's them, they own it forever. So no one wants a community to go into this without having done a lot of preparation and thought through all the different options. So we would encourage communities to start the process with research. There's a lot of help out there at the moment for communities that want to go through a buyout. So there's ourselves at Comunity Land Scotland, Development Trust Association Scotland. If you're a development trust or if you're going through asset transfer, will help. And then the Scottish Land Fund, which is the main funder for buyouts, they also have advisors who can help through this process. So it's really important that communities do this research first, and if you're an intermediary and you're advising a community, that you also kind of encourage them to go through this process. Because what we find at Community Land Scotland is if we get a community that's kind of on step 3 and has made a few mistakes on step 1 to 2, then it's really hard to go back and kind of reverse that and make changes afterwards. So they kind of really scupper their chances if they get to stage 3 without having done the research. So if you're advising a community, we would say first thing you should get them to do is to phone up someone who knows about how this whole process works, so that they can set them out on a good path. The community at this stage might be looking to see, do we want to do community right to buy or negotiation or asset transfer? And there's no clear and straight answer to that. It really depends on the situation. Through community right to buy gives you a lot more protection because it effectively freezes the ownership of an asset. So if you think an asset is going to be sold on while you're going through this process, then you might want to go down that route because it gives you a bit more guarantee. But it's quite time consuming to go through that process. And if you've got a really good relationship with the business or individual that you're buying land or buildings from, then you might just want to go through a negotiated purchase because that's a bit simpler and has got less requirements in terms of what needs to be in your legal structure. At the early days, we'd be encouraging communities to do a lot of consultation. So this can be one of two things. Either you get a community coming to you that's already got a structure, so something like a development trust would be a really good starting point for a community to do a buyout, because they might need to make minor changes to their mem and art, but a development trust is the right kind of structure for a buyout. But it might be a community that just wants to buy one asset, they don't have any kind of legal structure, and so they would be looking to set up a new body. So that's quite a bit of work, and so you would want to be talking to the community to make sure that people do actually think it's a good idea. So if you're in a village, you might be holding a village hall meeting at this point, something bigger if you're in a city, to try and get some feedback from people at early stages, because it's a lot of work to go through a community buyout, and as I said, you own it for life, so it's a difficult thing to do if you don't have a lot of buy-in from a community. It's fine if you consult at the beginning and the community's got lots of questions, that would be expected, but if it's something people really don't want, then you might be wanting to consider whether you want to go forward with it at this step. Next of all, if you don't have a body, if you don't have a legal structure, you'd want to constitute a community body. So again, this is something that needs to be thought through. This is a scenario we see quite often, as a community has been given a kind of standard scale template and has set up that legal structure, and that's fine, you can do about it with a scale, but it probably needs to have particular things in the legal structure, such as open membership, a defined geographical area. And so again, these are all things the community should really be thinking about before they constitute. So the most common vehicle for a buyout probably is a scale. It used to be company limited by guarantee with charitable status. Bencoms are also used, company limited by guarantee. Those are also the three that you can use for community right to buy, but you need to have very specific things in your mem and arts that say who your ownership is and that give you protections about local control. So you'd want to be doing more consultation with the community at this point. So a community might have a really fixed idea of what it wants to do, and that's a real driver. So it could be that a community has identified there's a real shortage of affordable housing in their area, and the housing association, the council, have got no plans to build housing, and so it's down to the community to do it. So in that case, the community kind of already knows what it wants to do, but sometimes a community is looking to do something that's focused on the wider regeneration. So it could be about an area that's just been neglected, or people don't agree with some of the regeneration projects that have happened in the past, and they're trying to achieve something bigger, like reversing depopulation. In that case, you'd be looking to consult quite widely at that point to get people's ideas on what they thought the best way was to do that. So one of our members is Wenlock Heads down in Dumfries and Galloway, and they've got a population of 160 people, and when they did their consultation, they came up with 96 different ideas for what they could do to regenerate that area. So if you really open it up at this point, there's no shortage of ideas that come forward, but then you've got a job because you've got 96 different ideas. So what do you do next? So at this stage, you'd be looking to write a feasibility study. So the Scottish Land Fund is the main funder of buyouts, as I was saying, and it's got a two-step process, stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1 can help you with things like community consultation, feasibility studies, technical work, writing business plans, all the kind of preparation work. And that stage of Scottish Land Fund is still open. So the Scottish Land Fund, it's too late now to get into this round, which is going to close for kind of full capital applications in early autumn, because it would take you 6 months to go through a preparatory stage. But the general assumption is that the Scottish Land Fund will come back after the elections next year. There's no guarantees of that, but you know, everyone's kind of operating on that basis. So communities that are looking to do a buyout can still apply to stage 1 and do all of this preparatory work. So if the Scottish Land Fund comes back next year, they're kind of ready to go. And the Scottish Land Fund has historically funded applications up to 95% of capital value. They'll fund some revenue as well, but not enormous amounts, and they can fund up to £1 million. I think there's only been one case that's gone over £1 million in the life of the Scottish Land Fund. That requires ministerial approval. and it has been £10 million a year, but we don't know what form it's going to come back in next year. There's a lot of talk about there being more of a capital revenue split, because a lot of the communities that wanted to buy assets in this most recent round of Scottish Land Fund were assets that needed work afterwards to get them into working state, and at the moment there's not really any money around for that, so it might be that next year it comes back with more of a capital revenue mix. So you're doing your feasibility study, so you're bringing in a consultant at that point. So there's a number of consultants around who are really experienced in doing these kind of stage 1 processes for communities, and any other community that's been through this process will be able to tell you what their experience was like. So a lot of work we do at Community Land Scotland is putting people in touch with other communities that have done similar buyouts that might be able to recommend to people. So the person coming in to do this work is trying to whittle down the ideas, or if there's one idea, work through, is that idea feasible? So that the community is kind of ready to go when they buy their land with a feasible idea to get them moving in the first 5 years. This process of kind of a community kind of thinking about wanting to buy something, getting through to the acquisition point and doing all of these different steps, realistically is going to take a minimum of a year. There are communities that have done it in less in particular circumstances, but a year is probably about the minimum. And I think our community and our membership that took the longest took 13 years because they were trying to do something that was, they were trying to be the first to use a certain type of legislation, so that took a very long time, but 13 years is definitely not the norm. So once the communities have been through the feasibility study, they're then looking to write a business plan with all their financial projections, and this is normally looking at kind of 5 to 10 years after the buyout. If it's complex land buyout, then they'll probably be wanting to do kind of extensive technical and surveying work at this point as well, so maybe getting housing surveyed. It could be, you know, it could be that they're buying land that's not changed hands for hundreds of years, and the maps, sometimes, you know, the maps of land are, the boundaries are kind of streams that haven't been streams for 150 years. So it can be quite complex work at this point, looking at all of that. So by this point, you're getting to the stage where you're thinking, okay, we have or we haven't got a viable business. If we do think we've got a viable business, you're going back to present your findings to the community at that point. To decide if you want to go ahead and talking to funders to see if there's anything else that they need. If you're going through community right to buy, which Dave will talk you through this afternoon, you'd be looking at a ballot at this stage. And some communities, even with negotiated purchases, would do a ballot at this point just to make sure that they're kind of, their feelings about whether the community is bought in or not are right. And so we've actually seen that quite recently with one of our members doing a negotiated purchase. The ballot results just came in last week from that. So hopefully you brought your kind of landowner or building owner along with you along the way, and as it's a negotiated sale, they'd be happy to come with you. We've got a very detailed protocol to negotiated sales on our website, so for communities looking to buy estates particularly, we've got a protocol with Scottish Land and Estates, which is the membership body for private landowners, community landowners and rural businesses. So if a community is wanting to buy land from one of their members, then there's a kind of protocol people will go through. But even if they're not doing that, that protocol has got a very detailed guide to, I think it's got about 28 steps, so really broken down into the steps that a community would go through. And the other organisation that's got a very useful guide that communities might want to look at this point is Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which has got a detailed 10-step guide to community buyouts, and it's got things like how to write a brief for a consultant. So it's really good if the community wants to kind of learn from the previous experience of lots of other communities about what does and doesn't work. That's all written down. And we've got loads of information and films and case studies on our website as well. So at this point, if the community is all happy, they're putting their stage 2 application into the Scottish Land Fund, which that requires 5% match funding. So that's been done in lots of different ways, from communities doing their own fundraising to community share offers, to kind of getting large grants that can raise the whole 5% match funding. And once community is happy, it's got all the money together, it would be looking to put an offer, a proper offer in at that point and start the whole conveyancing process. If you're going through a Scottish Land Fund, one of their advisors will be working with you pretty much up until this point, but the lottery do all the behind the scenes work on this. So at this point, the community gets handed over to the lottery, who start case managing them through that kind of latter stage of the process. So if a community is, if they've got a very complex purchase and their the conveyancing process is difficult and there's lots of burdens that the private owner is trying to put on the community, then it's the lottery would be helping communities to work through the process at this point. So just a very quick thing about what we do. We're the representative body for community landowners. So we were set up in 2010 because some of those early community landowners like Egg and Gay and Neudart felt there was no one who had a kind of representative voice who was trying to make things easier for future community landowners. So those early communities are really passionate about other communities having the same opportunities they do. We were set up primarily to try and change policy, but also to help our communities share information with each other. So Community Land Scotland, we're quite a small team. We can't know everything about housing, definitely not how to set up a spaceport. So a lot of the work we do is about helping communities share information with each other. And we also do a lot of awareness raising work as well, talking to communities who might be thinking about going down this route, but also just sharing information about what community landowners do with the general public. And we can support communities to some extent through the process because we're a small team. We can't be really hands-on with communities, but kind of things we do is we often go out and speak at village halls about what community buyouts are. We help communities get through kind of sticky points where they might get stuck and trying to kind of come up with ideas for how they can get over them. So if you're working with a community, do feel free to send them to us, and if we haven't got the specialist advice to help them, we'll definitely know who has. And just a quick plug for a report that we brought out about 10 days ago, which is looking to see what community landowners were doing in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So many of our members kind of swept into action at the beginning of the lockdown, and a lot of them are both providing services but often acting as an umbrella for other community organisations. So we produced this report, which you can see on our website, and the journalist who pulled all this together for us said, if these community owners could buy and run an estate, a ferry or a woodland, if they could build a hydro scheme and new houses or erect wind turbines, if they could secure income streams of tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds, they could be relied on to make sure Mrs. McDonald's prescription was delivered and the shopping for the Cameron family was left at the door. So like later on today, I'm actually talking at a health webinar, which I never saw myself doing because they're very interested in how our members manage to get kind of delivery services for things like prescriptions up and running in 24 hours and no one else could do it because of the risks. And I think that kind of combination of being driven by what communities want, but also having a kind of very business-headed approach and being able to take managed risks is something that's really important to communities. So that's my very quick overview, and I'm going to hand over to Christina, who's going to talk about urban.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. Yes, thanks. So just to say, Lindsay, there have been already a few questions in the chat room. For anyone who doesn't see the message, there's a chat section in the meeting that you can use to pose any questions as we move along. And then after my presentation, which will be shorter than Lindsay's, we can have a discussion and cover those questions. Okay, so just bear with me 1 second while I get my presentation started. Oh, what's happening? Excuse me. Okay, there we go. Thanks for your patience. Hi everyone, thanks for your patience. My name is Kristina Nitsilova and I have been working with Community Land Scotland for the past 2 years in the capacity of Urban Development Officer. So my role has been mainly focusing on building the network and capacity of urban communities to take forward community ownership and community kind of led development projects. So as Lindsay has demonstrated with her presentation, the opportunities for local communities that emerged from community ownership of land and assets is huge. And so we believe that the same positive transformations can come from the ownership of urban land and buildings. And we believe that it can be a driver for sustainable development in the urban context as much as it has proven to be in the rural context. Again, since 2016, we have seen an increase in the number of urban communities that have accessed the Scottish Land Fund and completed buyouts. We're not saying that there wasn't community land ownership in the urban context before the Scottish Land Fund opened up for urban groups. So you'll be familiar with the community-led housing movement. So that's an example of a community-led ownership, but in its more diverse form, i.e. so owning different types of assets, it has really taken off since the Scottish Land Fund was could be accessed by urban groups. So we're thinking and seeing that it's about 25% of the kind of pipeline for the Scottish Land Fund is now coming from urban groups. So that can be towns as well as cities. And it's a really wide range of projects that groups are looking to develop through ownership. So from the ownership and management of urban woodlands for amenity use, as well as green space. We have some quite interesting town centre regeneration projects like the one in Dumfries called the Mid-Steeple Quarter that some of you might have heard of. They're trying to achieve quite an ambitious project. We have as well a lot of groups acquiring the buildings that they operate out of and then develop it into a kind of diverse venue as well as space for the community as well as business facilities. So here we have the picture of Kinning Park Complex in Glasgow, which is a very good example of an urban community buyout where it's for community use, but also they do a lot of hire of spaces with both offices and studios and kind of event space to generate income to subsidize what they're doing with their more kind of free program. In 2017, 2018, Community Land Scotland worked on the research to identify the challenges that urban communities are facing kind of in their journey to ownership. And so I've just picked up on some key issues that we found that then and that are still relevant now, 2 years down the line. At that point, there was relatively low awareness of the potential of community land ownership. So community groups themselves didn't realize that that model for working and development was available to them, nor could they access the funding to acquire and develop assets. There has been kind of less awareness from the kind of support and asset owning bodies as well, but that also is changing now with the implementation of the Empowerment Act and the statutory requirements on different public sector bodies, for example. And we're slowly working our way to kind of raise awareness with the private sector about community rights, which also has been an issue in the past. High land values in urban context are a huge issue. So for example, a group in Edinburgh looking to acquire some land could be looking to use up the whole Scottish Land Fund for the year, basically, just to acquire a small area of land. So we need to look at that in the long term. Also, the type of groups that operate in the urban context are slightly different. So fewer geographically based communities that kind of would fit the community landowner profile. So a lot of groups are having to kind of maybe change a bit their governing structure and their legal structure in order to be able to become community landowners, as we have seen in the rural context. Then we've also, there's quite a complex support system in terms of quite fragmented, different organizations focusing on different bits of the support for the whole community ownership journey. So that can be challenging for communities who are quite new coming into this and trying to navigate and learn, navigate quite a complex system and learn a lot in a short space of time. Sometimes we have observed that there's potentially lack of confidence in what urban communities can achieve. So more of a paternalistic kind of approach from the statutory bodies. But the more communities acquire land and assets and develop them and make success of it, I think that's part of the change that we're seeing also in the attitudes of these organizations. So what we have been focusing on since 2018, very much with the ethos of Community Land Scotland as a whole, is to build a knowledge base on community land ownership in the urban context. So we talk to and kind of connect a lot of urban groups to try and understand what challenges they're facing, what projects they're looking at, how they can be supported, and get a kind of a whole sector picture. And we've done a lot of awareness raising, so both on community level, but also with policymakers and decision makers and funders and so forth. So again, trying to reach quite wide audience with the basically ultimate goal of making the journey easier for communities to acquire assets and then basically reach their goals through that. And we have worked with more than 100 community groups so far through different events, learning exchanges. So yes, so if you're supporting any groups that fit the urban profile, do encourage them to have a look on our website and see what is there on offer, because we do quite a lot of work to kind of facilitate a lot of the learning that is involved in this process. And so as part of this presentation, I just wanted to share with you a short video case study that we created about one of our urban members operating in Edinburgh. They might be well known to some of you. They're called Bridgem Farmhouse.
One of our videos, we've got quite a few on our website if you want to have a look at the variety of different communities that have bought assets and what they're doing with them. I think we'll open up to questions now. Someone has asked if we'll share the PowerPoint, and we can do that. Yeah, we'll send them out through Eventbrite, and we'll send out a link to this webinar as well. But for now, we will get through the questions. If we don't manage to get through all the questions by 11:30, we'll take a note of who's asked them and then come back to you separately if that's okay. But we'll try and get through as many as we can just now. Was Cliff asking company limited by guarantee or SKU, which one was best? There's not really a hard and fast answer to that. It depends on a whole range of different things about what the community wants to do. And, you know, for example, if a community was looking to buy a shop, or if its activities were very focused on trading, then a SKU might not be the best option for them, because that could restrict some of the trading activity. So community shops particularly don't tend to go down the SKU route, because that can cause, you need to be a compliant body to start the process, so they need to see your legal structure and be happy with it. But it's worth communities taking a bit of time to look at all the different options in terms of tax impact and all of those kind of things, because with a company limited guarantee, you have to pay corporation tax and so on. So, I mean, people can have a chat with us about it, and there are other people out there that can have give some guidance about the pros and cons of all the different models. And also, we've got pretty much all those models within our membership. If anyone wants to talk to a community about what they think, you know, you could see Donna in that video saying she loves bound comms, but not everyone loves bound comms. It depends what you're doing. So if people want to talk to someone about their own experience of having a particular model, we can arrange that. Yeah, the next question about in which case local councils or central government would have the right to intervene. So yeah, this is a really complicated one. So in terms of government, community right to buy has got a requirement that if something went wrong, then there is an ability for the government to take the asset back. but that's never happened. So we don't know, actually, none of us, including the government, know what that process would look like if it happened. So of all the community buyouts that there have been so far, none of them have gone bust yet, and we hope they won't. I mean, it's probably inevitable that someday one will. It's a bit miraculous, you know, if you think that the failure rate for businesses is 50% in 5 years, and no community buyouts have gone bust yet. So what happens at that point is a bit of a mystery. In terms of councils, Lynn Mollison from DTAS will be able to give you much more of a technical insight into that, because that's the kind of thing they're working with every day. But and I think that is an ongoing situation because asset transfer legislation is fairly new. The lottery, which manages the kind of end stage of the Scottish Land Fund, they wouldn't be happy if they thought there was excessive clawback obligations in there, because it's public money that's been used to buy the asset, and they have to look and see, is it in the public interest to have excessive clawback in the kind of legal agreement. So Lynn will be able to give you much more insight into what the thinking is around that just now. If you're working with the community, yes, do feel free to get in touch with us. That's what we're there for. Because we're a network of communities, there's probably very few situations that another community has not been through before. So we can tap into that huge wealth of expertise within our membership if you want to get in touch. Community mental health project. Okay, so you'll have heard us talking in the presentation all about geographical communities. So the community right to buy, the Scottish Land Fund, our own membership requirements, same with DTAS, are all around geographical communities. If a social enterprise feels like it is happy to go down this route and have the asset in community ownership, it's possible to do that. So at stage 1 of the Scottish Land Fund application, you can apply, and a body can apply to stage 1 that is not the body that will finally take ownership. So it's an unusual circumstance, but it's not unheard of that a social enterprise would do the stage 1 work with going through the feasibility study, doing the community consultation, and a new body would be set up during that process, which would be community owned, and that would take ownership of the asset. That's perfectly possible, but social enterprise would have to think, does it, you know, would it be happy to give up control to the wider community, because it's the community that owns the asset in the end, and it's the community that's got control of it. So that's a question we get asked quite a lot, and there have been a number of social enterprises that have gone down that route, but not a huge number. I don't know if you want to say anything, Christina, about what Bridgem did, because they started out as more of a social enterprise and then became a community-owned body partway through.
They had quite a complex journey, didn't they, in that? Yeah, I don't know. It's quite specific, but it has been done. So I don't know. I don't really think going into too much detail with that.
So if a community wants to, like what Bridgem did, and this is another fairly common scenario where you might have a body that was, you know, a community body, but not having the kind of open democratic structure, and that want to either apply to the Scottish Land Fund, do community right to buy, or in their case run a community share offer, then Bridgem managed to kind of alter their organisation that they started out with and still come out of it at the other end being pretty much the same organisation with a different legal structure. Whereas in a lot of places, particularly communities that are buying community shops or community pubs that want to run community share offers to give them some cash to get the business started, often are starting out with kind of development structure model and then setting up a new BENCOM which runs alongside the existing development trust. So again, all kinds of possibilities, but I think the thing to think through first is, like, would you be happy with community ownership at the end of it? Because that's, if you go through this process, that's what you'll end up with.
And just to add, actually, yeah. 1 second. Yes, George, come in.
Yeah, it was myself that asked the question, but it's really just from a point of view. Obviously, it's quite a complicated process to go through, regardless of how you want to set up. And at this point in time, we're a simple social enterprise that's looking for a land base, someplace within Forth Valley area. But I think we would find it acceptable that ultimately, if community ownership of the land base itself was the ultimate result, that's fine. It's as long as we would have access somewhere to a part of the land on which to establish a facility, very much like a Bridgem farmhouse, you know. That's the sort of, you know, it's just basically all around horticulture for us at the moment. But I can imagine that once you're on the way, that things would grow arms and legs anyway, or have them cut off.
Part of the knack of it is reining in the growth of arms and legs. It can be a tricky thing in itself.
Yeah, and that's the point then, is that I feel that, you know, we'll be starting out on a road where the destination isn't necessarily fixed. It's going to take twists and turns along the way. But the basic thing for us is that we've got the ambition, or whatever you want to call it, to establish a community base in some form or another. So it sounds as though it's worth exploration, but I think for what you're saying, that we'd have to be prepared to put in some hard work. You know?
Yes, I mean, you'd have to do extensive community consultation as well. So you have two options. If you're a local development trust, you potentially could go to them and ask, would they be willing to work with you to buy the land? That's happened in some places where woodland groups have wanted to buy the woodland, and they've worked with the local development trust to acquire it. So the development trust owns it, but the day-to-day management is done by the woodland group. Or you could go through the process on your own, in which case you'd need to show that that the community had buy-in to the whole idea, and that it wasn't, you know, kind of just an idea that your social enterprise wanted, but the wider community thought it was beneficial. But we can put you in touch with people who've gone from that the social enterprise through to community owned, and so you can see how it was done.
I just wanted to add one thing actually about Bridgem. I think they're a very good example for an urban group that started like as a group of interest, so it was more of a community of interest that then transformed into more of a community bound by the local area, so they became more of a geographic community, and with that came kind of the change in their legal structure. And I think that's quite common in the urban context. So you have a lot of organizations, you know, with charitable aims around well-being or, you know, access to green space or whatever. But then in order to become community landowners, they have to kind of become in membership-led, open membership to their local community. And then it becomes this new entity that becomes the landowner, if that, I just think that's a very good illustration actually of what I was trying to highlight in my presentation. I think there was a question around that, so I hope that answers it a bit more. Thanks.
I've got a question from Cliff about property acquisition. Well, that's a good question. If a community is wanting to go through this process and that they've got a building that they don't want to own, then this probably isn't the right process for them. But if they want to buy a building that needs adaptations afterwards, that's certainly possible, but something a community would need to think about at the beginning is how they're going to fund that post-purchase development, because there's not a huge amount of funding around for that. And the Scottish Land Fund will look and see, is this realistic? Because what they don't want a community to do is buy an asset that they're then stuck with and can't do anything with until they raise the funds to do development. If it was quite a commercial kind of journey community was looking to go through, it might be possible for them to get loans or mortgages to go through that. So again, this is the kind of thing that you'd need to be thinking about at the beginning. How would you be able to make your case to the Scottish Land Fund that you're actually going to be able to do something with that building afterwards? And quite a few communities that want to go down that route have got stuck at that point because they haven't been able to make a case. Things like housing are a bit easier because there is funding out there, particularly if you're taking empty homes and things back into use. There's specific funding around that. So again, have a chat with us and we can talk you through some of the options. So Fiona Jackson is asking about co-managing or leasing assets is also a route. So yes, absolutely. We would never say a huge amount of money. Lease it in the long term rather than take on ownership when they can't, you know, trying to think about how you would still be able to own it in 50 years time and raising the money to run it can be off-putting for people. So yeah, it's something a community should be thinking about at the beginning. Some of the benefits around ownership are not the obvious ones. I mean, Community Land Scotland, we are obviously about ownership. It's what we do and what we're really passionate about, because we see the whole kind of building of community confidence that happens when a community owns assets, and also their kind of ability to develop other services, negotiate with other bodies. So absolutely, leasing, it might be right for some communities, but we would encourage communities to have a kind of detailed think through of what the kind of pros and cons of ownership versus leasing is. Sometimes the owners of buildings or land, particularly in the public sector, might feel more comfortable with leasing, but in some cases we would say to communities, you know, is that the best option, particularly if you want to go for funding to develop a building? That's going to be hard if you've got a particularly short lease. So I would say if you're being offered leasing, don't just say yes. You might want to think through some other alternatives, but again, we're happy to talk through that with people. The fragmentation, spatial distribution of the community. Not for this scenario. You can't have a community that's in different geographical locations coming together to do a community buyout. So particularly around community right to buy, is the whole kind of legislative rights that communities have are very much about human rights of a geographic community and their right to things like housing and so on. And so that's why Community Right to Buy, Scottish Land Fund and so on are focused on specific geographic locations and how that place can benefit itself through ownership. We get a lot of people contacting us where you might have a group of people that want to come together and set up a co-housing project, or own land together. It might be a community of interest, and there are other routes for those people. Particularly communities of interest can use asset transfer legislation, which Lynn Wilson will be talking about this afternoon. But if you want to access the Scottish Land Fund or Community Right to Buy, then you need to be a specific geographic community with a clear boundary. With Community Right to Buy, that's very specific, and you need to define that by postcodes, community council wards. There's a whole kind of different options for that. Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things about human interaction is that we've been talking to a lot of our communities recently about how they're getting on with COVID-19, because many of our communities are really actively involved in the community response. And although everyone is social distancing, a lot of our members have said there's never been such a strong feeling of community as there is now. So it's kind of interesting. We've got a lot of socially distanced community building happening at the moment. The differences, I mean, I can't explain in 3 minutes the differences between Community Right to Buy and asset transfer. Asset transfer applies to public bodies, devolved public bodies, so not like the MOD, but devolved bodies like local authorities, NHS. There's a whole list of them. If you're watching the other webinars that are happening today, you'll get a kind of blow-by-blow account of how each of those work. But I'd say the main difference is that asset transfer only applies to public bodies. Community Right to Buy applies to almost everything. There are a few exceptions, but not very many. So you can use Community Right to Buy on privately owned assets or publicly owned assets. Asset transfer can be used by communities of interest or communities of geography, whereas Community Right to Buy can only be used by communities of geography. Both have got very specific processes that communities need to go through. And so, yeah, I mean, the basic Community Right to Buy, which is the one that came out in 2003, I think the guidance on that is like 160 pages long, although half of that is in Gaelic, but both are still very complex. So if you want to have a longer conversation about the differences, happy to chat through some of those, but you'd really only be trying to choose between the two if you were looking to buy a building or land from a public body, because you can't use asset transfer for private purchases.
And one more point about asset transfer, you can apply for a lease through the asset transfer process, where Community Right to Buy is for ownership.
Do you want to talk about how Bridgem creates funds, Christina?
I think the list of funders is probably endless. Yes, so I think they're predominantly grant dependent from. So actually, they didn't use the Scottish Land Fund, but I think they access the National Lottery's growing community assets to upgrade their building. So the building which they acquired was completely, basically a shell. So they that was something they accessed funding for, and then they deliver different projects. So you saw the cafe. So I think that receives funding from a health body. And then they have just various streams depending on the different projects they deliver. But I think what's unique about them is how diverse their activities are, and therefore the different sources of funding that they can access through that. I hope that's helpful.
We're at 11:30 now. I think Christina and I would be happy to stay on for another 10 minutes and try and get through some of the questions. Obviously, if you've got somewhere to be, you can leave us now and we'll be sending out the recording so you can watch the last 10 minutes. But I think we'll just try and get through some more of these questions while we're both here. So yeah, negotiated purchase versus community right to buy. Well, it's a really difficult balance that a community has to make. There's pros and cons to both of them, but I suppose with community right to buy, if the main benefit of the one that came out in 2003, there are new ones now, but the main benefit of that one is that it does freeze ownership. So if you're worried about land or building being sold out during the time that you're trying to raise all the funds, then community right to buy will stop that happening. But the 2003 one can't force a sale. All it can do is stop the owner selling to anyone else. So basically when the owner wants to sell that asset, the community gets first dibs on it and has time then to raise the funds at that point. There are some bodies that will require a community to go through community right to buy just so community can demonstrate the process, that they've been through a process. So MOD is one example of that, and historically Church of Scotland has required communities to do that as well, although I think they might be reconsidering that. A lot of it depends on judgment calls, because although an owner shouldn't be feel like their rights have been taken away by community going through community right to buy, sometimes land and building owners see it that way. So if you've got a really positive relationship and you're happy with that relationship and you feel like there's not a high risk of the landowner changing their minds, then going through a negotiated purchase is probably better. A community right to buy is very, there's a lot of different requirements that are very kind of black and white that you have to follow absolutely to the letter, and you have to prove, you know, high level of public interest. You have to prove it's the purchase for the sustainable development of the community. So it's not right for everybody, but it does give you that protection from things being kind of lost midway through the process. There are other ways to do that through negotiated sale, softer ways, like having a memorandum of understanding with a landowner that sets out what's expected from both sides, and having something like that at the beginning can reduce the chance of things going wrong in the middle. But we would never advise a community you should definitely go down one route or the other, because there's risks with both approaches. Yeah, very happy to have a chat with people. Oh, I don't think there's any more questions. Have I missed anything, Christina?
Oh no, you haven't. I think. Pardon me.
Oh, that's good. We've only gone 3 minutes over, but yeah, I mean, if you go onto our website, you'll see our contact details. Do feel free to get in touch with us and have a look through all the different resources on our website. Yeah, and we're here to help should you need to get in touch. Thank you, everybody.